Oh, I'm going to actually use the mic, the handheld mic here. But first, I really want to acknowledge that I'm here first. Is this on? No. How about that? No.
Keep going. There we go. All right, great. So thank you so much for the really kind introduction. And I am here as a farmer, but also as research director for Wolf's Neck Center for Agriculture and the Environment. And I have the pleasure, as you mentioned, of leading a collaborative, which is now a global collaborative, which Kivera is a part of, called OpenTEAM, or Open Technology Ecosystem for Agricultural Management. And we'll get into more about what that all is, but I really want to talk more about why we do what we do and why it's important first. But before we get into that even, I want to call out, again, a special gratitude to Kivera and the role that it's played in my own personal journey here too. I really felt in that event in 2001 that I had found my people. It was really important. I felt very quite isolated in some of the work I was doing in the Northeast, and it was just incredibly, it was just really a transformative moment. And I got actually invited there. I met Courtney White, who was working on a book called Grass Soil Hope at the time, and he invited me to that first event. And I wanted to also make a special acknowledgement for why I said yes instantly when I was asked, because Courtney and I actually just completed a book together that will be coming out this spring called The Great Regeneration. So I'm really, just really, it's a celebration for me to come back here and see the growth and also acknowledge how much has happened in the last 10 years. When I showed up at that conference, there was not a USDA soil health division. It wasn't part of the national conversation. There were not Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities now investing billions into this space. There was, and the list goes on, the Soil Health Institute, and all the institutionalization, the mainstreaming of some of these ideas that are really taking hold, not only in the US, but internationally. So I really want to acknowledge that, and we're just getting started. So I feel like that's also really important. There's so much more work to do, and that's why, as we're thinking about agriculture and regenerative agriculture, that this is something, it's a shared human endeavor. This is a multi-generational shared human endeavor. And we're asking so much more of agriculture, not just food, fiber, and energy, but a lot of what we're asking for is climate regulation and equity and biodiversity and flood and drought mitigation and wildfire mitigation, and we're also seeing the incredible consequences that are driving some of these decisions. And so we need a new approach to the way in which we conduct agricultural science. And I would make the case that it's a public science, it's a systems science, and we're all part of it. It is not it is again not just a solitary enterprise by farmers in rural enterprises, but really this is again a shared human endeavor. So with that, you all know this in terms of the urgency, but I just want to highlight again the trends, the acceleration. There's a quote that said something like, things are getting worse and worse and better, faster and faster. And so we know that our population, fertilizer consumption, transportation, telecommunications, all accelerating at rapid rate, as are the negative indicators in terms of how the Earth is responding. John did a beautiful job this morning of describing this, but we also have, at the same time, accelerating trends in our technology to tell this story. Without all of these graphs come from our own observations. We've just been behind the curve. So part of what I want to make the case for today is, how do we switch this around? How do we become globally conscious using these same tools? How do we move from a different mindset using some of the tools that we've been able to begin to understand the natural environment in which we're working, to move from this concept of precision agriculture into something that's about decision ag. How do we understand and democratize access to all the agricultural knowledge that exists, and how do we create the tools that will empower land stewardship? How do we do that at all scales? How do we make it accessible across all cultures and geographies, ubiquitous and low cost and accurate? So how do we do that? Because that is certainly possible. Every farm has the possibility to become an observatory, to become a research farm, to become a learning experience. And we know, again, we can, the challenge at this point is to move ourselves from an extractive mindset into, of course, we're all here for regenerative, but to the system that is relying more on the commonwealth of nature, where we're investing, where it becomes more knowledge intensive rather than input intensive, where we're relying on the systems that have worked for millions and billions of years to deliver the results. And so, it means relying on this commonwealth of nature, this that's been built over billions of years, the seeds, the breeds, the technologies, the seeds, the breeds, and the technologies that we can mix our own knowledge with to deliver that result. And so I want to just take a moment also to think about this term. I'm really kind of repurposing it a little bit, but the idea of commonwealth, because this is our commonwealth are the things that we can all experience together, and as we use, we can improve. And knowledge is one of those things, again, that's non-rival. By using it, it can become, it becomes better. And it follows the similar pattern to the way the genetics of nature works. We can improve it with use. If we have a dead end, it's a loss. And so we have an opportunity, as I mentioned, with the technology to use some of the patterns that have existed over billions of years. I look to the model of mycorrhizal fungal networks that communicate in the natural world. And yet in agrarian cultures, we've been trying to build and have built similar knowledge exchange systems for as long as agriculture has existed. But I particularly like the diagram of the circulatory system of information exchange here that was published actually I used this I think in 2011 in the same presentation, but that it was published in a Sears and Roebuck catalog for Encyclopedia of Practical Farm Knowledge, and it was describing in about 1918, there was a very robust agrarian movements creating clubs across the country, like the Grange, but many other much more progressive organizations that share a lot of the same values that we're hearing today in this group. But the idea was really that it's about not just ideas, but information and inspiration, because the inspiration is key to take action, and creating that circulatory system. And so, again, this process, that circulatory system, has existed as long as agriculture, and yet we do have, as John mentioned this morning, this incredible resource now. In the middle picture is a map of the global internet, which is roughly, just to put it in context, we have mycorrhizal networks looking at millions and billions of years worth of genetic evolution. Our current internet is maybe, 6,000 days old, something like that? So we're looking at days. So I want to take another moment to sort of dwell on the concept of abundance, which also was a theme this morning that John mentioned. But in addition to knowledge being something that's abundant, the more we use it, the more there is of it. But also, a lot of what we're looking at as we look to transition to the regenerative economy is also abundant. Again, we have this incredible biodiversity resource where it's been developed over millions of years to grow things anywhere on Earth, and the raw elements to support that. So the surplus of nitrogen and carbon and water in the atmosphere that needs to be redistributed through our knowledge. So, but there's some human elements that we can bring to help create that abundance. One is first recognizing that there is an alternative economy that's based on growth of natural systems rather than extraction. A second is that we need to create public utilities and private enterprises and cooperatives in balance. It requires all three, and we'll get into that a little bit as we look at the technology that we're developing to do that. Another is that part of the tools and technology that we're developing needs to make that abundance and the requirement for that abundance to exist visible through recognizing the role that nature has in our lives and creating the common infrastructure to be able to record that history, that human history, that biological history on the ground so that we can recognize it and we can celebrate it and create new culture and rituals around it. And then I'll spend a bit of time here on practice and theory, or a practical theory of change. The tools, the incentives, and the examples that we need to actually move this movement forward. But before we do that, I wanted to, this was also in John's presentation, but I do want to give us a little, a moment to reflect, because it's easy when we're talking about technology and mycorrhizal fungal networks to not take the step back and look at and I like to think about this in terms of how we're framing our collaboration and our competition. If we're looking at, and you hear this a lot in terms of natural symbiosis, is that it's not survival of the fittest at the individual species level. It's really survival of the fittest systems and the ecosystems. But if we look a little bit broader, this little dot is a new version of Carl Sagan's pale blue dot. So that's Earth taken from just beyond Saturn. And that's, again, looking at the preservation of what we're curating in terms of life on Earth, and that the competition is not, again, necessarily even the ecosystems, but it's essentially order versus chaos. And so we have an opportunity, again, to place the work that we're doing on a day-to-day basis, not only in our communities, but on the landscape level, and provide that third-person perspective. We now, part of the open source technology movement has given us the ability to access that context. So on the left is the image from 90,000 feet looking over over the Finger Lakes. And then the ability, I was particularly inspired early in the farm hack world is connecting with organizations like Public Lab before drones were invented, to take a $30 camera and be able to image our own farm and be able to get that perspective. But it really is that third-party perspective. To put our work in this broader context is really important, and it's expanded incredibly in the last decade in terms of what we're capable of. And I love the connections in the imagery that we're able to now access together. For the one image, there is rice paddies, a human-managed landscape, and the other is mitochondrial networks at the cellular level. And again, the ability for us to envision these things, I believe, gives us a responsibility to manage them and to take responsibility for the incredible order that's been created over these billions of years. So what does that look like? How do we actually do that? So as incredible as the tools and technology are that allow us to provide that visibility into the way nature actually works, and again, we're just scratching the surface, it requires more than technology. It requires tools that work. That's a given. It's necessary, but not sufficient as we're building new tools and technology on the farm. But we have to have incentives to actually use those new tools. They have to fit into a context that will actually drive the adoption. And that's not sufficient either, because we also have to learn how to use these new tools, whether they're biologically based, it's like the movement away from a plow into a tillage radish. It requires a new set of knowledge as much as a new tool. And then we need examples and inspiration to be able to see what's possible. And so that's what the new agrarians are about. This is what this group is about, is providing those examples, those success stories, to give us that inspiration to move forward, to push the edges, to make that change. And so there's a art and science of transitioning from, again, those individual enterprises into collaboration and knowledge sharing. And that's, again, what OpenTEAM is about, is how do we create the large-scale collaboration so we can use the global knowledge, this global knowledge commons that we're building, and equip food system leaders like yourselves with equitable, accessible, and interoperable tools to be able to share our knowledge to improve our soil health and ecological outcomes. And so over the last couple years, we've built a community of more than 45 organizations, including farm and ranch networks and food companies, government agencies, both in the US and internationally, technology providers and marketplaces and research universities. And in the last climate smart commodities work, we're over 65 members that are working together on that. So growing the community. But again, I want to highlight the work on the ground. As much as we're collaborating at the organizational level, none of this works if it doesn't work on the ground. And I recently was reading about the origin of the FAO in the 40s, coming out of World War II and Reconstruction and post-colonial development, with a lot of hope in terms of appropriate small-scale technology and agricultural knowledge as being the foundation for building a new, more independent post-colonial order. And they've talked a lot about land mapping and building a global soils database and equipping a new generation of extension agents and technical service providers to work on behalf of local communities, from those communities, to distribute and build a global knowledge base. It was very inspiring to read that, and also disheartening to see the destruction of that vision through export-based agriculture in the 70s. But it's there, and I feel like we have another shot at that. This is a moment, this is an inflection point to think, again, if they were as ambitious as that in the 40s, and we have another shot at it with a whole new set of, a new generation ready to take on that charge. And so I just really want to celebrate the new agrarians and the fellows within OpenTEAM that are taking on that role to engage and facilitate the transfer of tools and technology and co-develop the solutions that are going to work. But as we talked about earlier, it's not just about public enterprise or cooperative. It's also about preserving community sovereignty, and food sovereignty is related to data sovereignty. And so we have this tension as we're working towards building our commonwealth of nature and our commonwealth of knowledge, is that we're also needing to preserve, again, the quality of our communities. And those are often feel in tension, but they don't need to be. And so we've been applying, there's a movement in the data world around the fair in practice, or findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But we've also been adopting principles, the CARE principles, which you may be familiar with, which is a collective benefit, authority to control, and responsibility and ethics, so that we can work both at this global level, but also work towards local sovereignty in the way we handle data. And that's really at the foundation of all of the tools and technology that we build. And again, I'm not talking so much about the tools themselves, but how we approach it. Because we think that that's the most important thing, is to build trust at the individual level, because this large-scale global interoperability doesn't work unless we maintain trust from the individual producer level all the way up. And so this is where we shift into some of the tools and technology we're building. At the foundation of it is a concept we're calling an ag data wallet. And that essentially provides data sovereignty at the individual producer level. And so that's fundamentally different than the way almost all other systems are currently designed. You all know about data breaches because you enter your data on somebody else's system. And then if you want to access that system, you sign a release. What we're saying is, no, actually, you enter your data for yourself, and if they want to access your information to provide your service, they ask you for your information for that one service. So that's foundational. What that also means is that we can start to enter data once and use it many times. And so that means if you're applying for FSA, you enter your data, they ask for it, they pull it in, it auto-fills out their forms. If you're applying for another USDA program, you don't have to do that yet again. Or if you're applying for organic certification, you use the same, enter all that information. That can be used for an additional certification for food safety, say. And so that's a really important foundational piece and architecture that we think is necessary to move the ecosystem forward. Likewise, if you're starting a conversation, one of our members is called Hilo. It's an alternative to Facebook. So again, you maintain your data, your information, your conversations, your identity. That opens up a whole host of possibilities so that we can both run our private enterprises, create the groups that we want to create, exchange the information that we want to exchange with each other, and build an architecture that's intended to support ecological regeneration and trust and community from the ground up, rather than trying to look to a private enterprise to provide that as a byproduct. If this is that important, why don't we build the infrastructure that we actually need to support and answer the questions and build the trust that we actually need to move forward? And so that's what we also find is necessary for creating the public science. To answer the questions that we need, we have to have trust at this base level. Because what we found when we were starting to go through and work with researchers and markets and companies and producers themselves is that there's a great desire to share data. Data privacy is kind of a misnomer because what we really get value when we share it and we combine it and we with one another to gain insights. But we don't want to be abused in that process and lose agency and go through the same power imbalance that's happened in the last generation of technology and agriculture. And so what we found is that all of these systems, all of these stakeholders need high quality information at the farm level. Site-specific decision support. How do we make better adaptive management decisions? All the things that we're talking about with holistic management. We're taking our observations and putting them in context. Well, all the researchers need that as well. So can we share our information then with the researchers? Well, what do government programs and certifications want? Well, they want the same information, but usually not even at the same resolution. They want it at a higher level. They don't need this. They don't need your individual samples. They want to look at the big picture. And then the same with the new ecosystem service markets. So if we can enter data once, and we have at a high quality that we can use with our own technical service providers, then we can make this easier for everybody and have confidence. So what this also leads to is the ability to start to create from this data sovereignty perspective, the ability to create new cooperatives. So as we're talking about, moving beyond food, fiber, and energy, pretty much all the rest of the claims where we're asking for, where we're creating new value, exist in some sort of claim, which exists in some sort of data. That's a lot to manage for individual producers, and we shouldn't expect individual producers. That's why we have extension and technical service providers. This is a collaborative, large-scale collaborative effort, not just on producers. So we have to create cooperative structures to be able to manage this. That's where we can aggregate our data and manage it together. But there is another public aspect to this. So as we're creating our private enterprises, part of it is creating a public benefit and telling the history of our land. So this is the human history, the biological history, the soils, the water. These are all observations that we make, but that shouldn't be ours. That should be part of the shared human history that exists beyond our own lifetimes. So we have the opportunity to contribute that into a library and to maintain that, and we're, the power of, and think about what a library does, right? It's not necessarily open to everybody, and this is where it's also important. There are some parts that are culturally significant that are in the restricted section, say. So it's important to put it into the public domain, but also be able to control how that's accessed. So all of that is the foundation for some creativity that you heard that's possible on the marketplace side. And so you heard a little bit yesterday from Jessica and some of the work that's being done to be able to take some of these attributes at the farm level and turn them into visualizations, into the unique fingerprints. The process of decommodifying agriculture happens at this level. One of the reasons that we commodify is because these are hard to measure. These things are, the transactions are difficult because they're, this wheat is the same as this wheat, but really it's not. Right? We know that the cultural practices that produced it have value, and we want to value that. Well, how do we capture that? How do we create the stories behind it that have that value? And so we see that, again, this is one example of a creative way of moving that vision forward. And giving the possibility not only of using that in the marketplace, but being able to take that detailed information that we're gathering at the individual farm level and to ask better questions, and to start to benchmark our own work with others. So we're creating a tool called a digital coffee shop. So just like we sit down and coffee and talk about the context with our neighbors, how might we do that same process more globally and look at not just questions around soil health, but what were the unique situation, what was the unique soils that for that observation, or the size of the production, or the climate that that was recorded in. Being able to organize groups around those kinds of questions. And related to that, that process is we're recognizing that as much in production systems as we've had difficulty, or with things like organic, it's tended to divide people. But we've found in OpenTEAM that when even across some of these traditional boundaries in agriculture, we can often agree on the questions we're trying to ask. And in fact, we need one another to ask those questions to actually say, well, what actually works? And so by being able to aggregate and share questions, it creates a new way of collaborating. And so we're building a collaborative question set that looks at our economic questions, our management questions, our social questions, our environmental questions. How do we actually compare those as we're setting out and seeing who's asking the same questions, and can we collaborate on answering those together? So I think that's both technology, but also has a core community and social element. So we see that these can be combined again from our local markets and creative tools. Again, we're a toolkit, but there are ways in which you can apply these both from the local farmers market to be able to also start to answer some of the global sustainable development goals and things, and global health indicators. So in conclusion, we've gathered in the last 1,000 years an incredible understanding, an incredible ability to begin to interpret our environment. And we built an incredible toolkit to be able to transform the landscape. We've shown that we can transform it in an extractive way and create incredible destruction. We've also shown that the reverse is true, that we can be beneficial organisms on that landscape. But I want to make the point here in closing also that it's not, there are ways of doing this without any of this technology. If we can internalize the values that we're trying to, and we can improve the quality of our communication across our communities, we can do that through oral tradition. We can do that through stories. We can do this in many, many other ways. But we also have an urgency to do this quickly. So I say, what are the values we can bring to the tools and technologies we have now to interpret our environment and to tell those stories and to create better governance? And so I wanted to take a moment to, this quote came across my mind this morning, and I'm going to read it. It was from a Roman statesman in ancient Rome, and he said, this is before it became an empire. He said, in bygone days, the land offered us her fruits in abundance, and had taken pleasure in being cultivated by triumphant hands. And to match this honor, she increased her yield with all her might. Today, this is no longer the case. We have abandoned her to mercenaries and to slaves, and it's tempted to think that she has felt the affront. So this is as old a pattern as civilization, but I think we have, again, this multi-generational path to shift the power again, to take another shot. And I think that we have an opportunity to create new cultural patterns and rituals, one of which I think would be to start taking an oath in agriculture as professionals in a new way that acknowledges, just like we do in, just like those who handle our health or our money take an oath of care, that we should take pride and create a public oath and a process for what we have at our hands and what we're stewarding. And to also, part of that is to pass along this knowledge and to share it fully and pass it on to, pass our knowledge and the land that we steward on to those who will also uphold that oath. So, and I think that's the basis fundamentally for a regenerative enterprise. So thank you so much for your time. Oh, so I guess questions.
Thank you. Yeah, we have some time for questions. Are there questions right now in the audience?
Excellent presentation. Could you elaborate a little bit more on your USDA Climate Smart Agriculture, Climate Smart Commodities work?
Sure. So OpenTEAM was the lead on one, and we're also working with a number of other organizations on a few others, including the Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Ag and American Farmland Trust. But we have about 65 organizations that co-signed with us that we'll be collaborating with, particularly in California, Colorado, and the Northeast. And we'll be developing open source tools and technology for measurement, reporting, and verification, the creation of a common, what we're calling CSA connector, to allow producers to find one another, to be able to make their products visible to funders and marketplaces, and create essentially that you know, if you're familiar with the common application for colleges, essentially creating a common application to streamline access to transition and transformational finance. So we'll also be creating transformational finance pools that will be compatible with USDA funding, but will be able to accept not just USDA-based funding, but other funds direct funded through food systems transactions and other aspects. So lots to it, but that's the gist in a nutshell.
Awesome. We have one from the virtual audience. This question is there's an apology for a difficult question that comes along with it. Curious what one or some of the biggest potential negative impacts of such large data frameworks that your group thinks about, or put differently, what sorts of imagined futures, if everything went completely sideways, keep you and your team up at night?
It's a great question because the tools and technologies, as we know, in internet can be used for high quality information or disinformation at the same time. We see the flip side of aerial imagery being used daily for destruction purposes as well as constructive purposes. So yeah, I mean, I think the worry certainly is that yet again the innovation and the energy of the collaborative work and communities gets corrupted and usurped, and the power balance doesn't shift. And we just accelerate the status quo. So that's always a worry.
Yeah.
And yet I think that's why it's so important to lead with values and creating structures with integrity and trust from the foundation. And so I remain hopeful, and I feel like that's our maybe a hopeful realist, I think is maybe a good description. But I think we have the long arc of history on our side. And I hope that groups like this can, again, help hold this vision and all of us accountable in that pursuit.
Thank you. Other questions?
We had two questions. One was about your book, if you could just reiterate what that was about, that you're about to release in the spring.
So, the subtitle, I don't quite have off the top of my head yet, but it is The Great Regeneration, and it is essentially outlining a radical vision of hope and the potential for, and lining out the abundant resources we have, and how we might put them into practice, and providing a few use cases and a bit of my sort of journey towards regeneration, because I think regeneration really is a continual journey that we all take individually and as communities, and trying to frame that process.
All right, my second question is a little less straightforward, but I can't help but feel the juxtaposition between a group of young people standing in front of us that are getting their hands in the dirt and lots of hexagon-shaped visuals representing a concept of something I understand, but don't quite maybe have. I feel like there could be a potential for a lot of young people to become passionate about what you're putting out and what you're trying to create. And I also see a lot of young people who want to get themselves into positions of being useful and being valued in a context where they're often undervalued and disrespected and misunderstood. So do you feel that there's a potential with what you're putting forward with the technological differences between the Roman era and modern day? Because yes, this has been going on for a long time in human history, but it isn't until this moment in human history that we have such a surplus of young, talented youth who understand systems like this that do want to contribute.
I would say that's the only reason that OpenTEAM exists, is because the energy of the young people and older people, but a lot of young people who have taken the dive and have joined the community and have driven this. It really has been a community-driven effort, and I can't say enough about the fellows and the team and the folks who are showing up across the board. So yeah, I would say that regeneration is really this next generation's opportunity, because I also think we're at an inflection point, and we have this generation to really help guide us and to take advantage of the tools at our fingertips to really make it happen and to tell that story.
So is that something that you see, just in terms of your vision of where this is going, is that kind of the way in which it's been manifesting, at least currently, is that there's a lot of young people who understand these things that are working with those who don't in order to make your system work for those who this is never going to apply to because they come from an older generation kind of thing? Yeah, no, they don't necessarily have to be younger, but there is an trusted intermediary role that we've seen as necessary. I know that from my own farm. I live and work on our family farm, and my parents don't use an ATM. My father doesn't know how to turn on a mobile phone. And yet, we still need to be able to transmit knowledge in other ways, and that's people. And so I think a huge part of this, that's why I want to emphasize that it's technology-enabled community development, but community development can happen without the technology. We need those relationships and the people. And it does so happen that young people can be that bridge between the global knowledge that we're pulling in, but ultimately linking in and building local trust and applying that in ways that actually work, because the knowledge has to flow both ways. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity also for the next generation, as we saw with the young agrarians, to be learning and making that connection. But I think that's the thing that's exciting. That's what's exciting for me. I mean, most of what I do on my farm is informed by things that I've learned, not by, it'd be wonderful if they were all my neighbors, but really it was because of communities like this that I was able to connect to. So I think that's what we're trying to reproduce, is creating those connections between this global and regional knowledge base in agriculture, and being able to bring that into communities that and create that connection without alienation. It's a tricky balance, and that's one of the key things I think we're going to we are working most on, is how do we build that trust and those relationships, and make sure that, again, the technology is not driving us, but we're be able to use the technology to create and improve the quality of those relationships.
Thank you. We have time for one more, and then we'll wrap up.
Yes, old guys sometimes can get away from things, so I want to honor two people that brought us to where we are today, and I want to also honor all the young people that are coming forward. That's awesome. But those two people I've been thinking about are Robert Rodale, who came up with the term organic, which I think Robert Rodale Sr. was in the 40s, and of course that was when we started this extractive process. The other person that is very important in terms of this group being here is Alan Savory. And so I want to honor those two people, but I also want to bring an issue forward from those two people, because they were two people that were considered people with disinformation. And so we need to be very cautious not to get to the place where we become the people that control the disinformation that produces our future. Thank you.
Well, I guess I would agree that that's one of the opportunities that we have here by bringing in new observation tools that can observe in more detail, and to provide the context that is often used to discredit those observations, and to create the new data sets where we can reproduce some of those results and make claims that are verifiable And also recognize that we're asking, and I actually also shift that, that these claims are not just about authority, they're about asking questions over generations, and that we're actually on the same time, we actually want to know what works. So rather than saying it's my system or it's the other system, it's like, well, what works? How do we actually put these systems together over time and have a conversation? And part of that is using the same tools to measure. But there's nuance in that, of course, because if you're just measuring yield and you're not measuring it over time or profitability, I mean, you could add any number of those things. That's our opportunity, is to be able to really start to tell the fuller picture. And we're telling it at the systems level. But it's not easy for an individual producer to do that. So that's also the case that I'm trying to make, is that this is building on a lot of those observations, but how do we actually create this trusted global knowledge set that can help with those level of ecological observations, systems levels observations that are very difficult to do the way traditional research in science is done in plots on research farms. So that's, I think, the opportunity, but it takes participation and community to do that. And I'm not going to try to say that we've got it all figured out, but I am going to say that I am very confident that together we can do that. So, thanks.